My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Jason Kilmer to talk about cannabis, the role of parents and community in prevention. Jason, take it away.
I'm Jason Kilmer. I appreciate the chance to work with you. I fear the person that claims they have all the answers. That is not me, but I'll do what I can to speak to what the science says as best as possible. Big thank you to Charlene, Bev, and the Parent Venture for this invitation. Thanks to all of you for doing what you do for your communities. I said I'd cover a number of things: how cannabis potency has changed, how cannabis affects sleep, mental health, the addiction related to cannabis use, and even withdrawal symptoms, and issues related to driving. I'll try and leave as much time for your questions as possible. I got to see, right before I got on, all of my coworkers on Zoom. We actually still haven't even been in the same room since March 6, 2020. We were the first university to close when the world shut down in March 2020. I'd been home for about a month when I received this from a coworker. That's a tough thing to receive from another person. Can you imagine seeing this article and being, well, I know I look good, but you know who needs this? Jason. So I got it and I'm like, really? Who sends that to people? And I clicked on it because who wouldn't? And it said the #1 way to look good on Zoom is lighting. So on top of thanking Charlene and Bev and all of you, I want to thank my co-presenter, Lampy. Lampy's been sitting close to me for the last 2.5 years and frankly is one of only 4 friends that I have at this point. So thanks, Lampy. What I will say is this: for years, I said research has to catch up on the potency we see in the present. I changed that slide. Research is caught up. If you orient the brain such the front of the brain is on the left, the back of the brain is on the right, you see all the different parts of the brain associated with different functions. The most well-studied cannabinoid in cannabis is THC. Where does THC bind in the brain? All over the place. I can't graphically show you a high any better than if you look at the reward pathway, which is typically activated with there are substances where when there's a high, you can see that THC binds exactly there. When we work with really driven people, really motivated youth, young adults, you name it, people have asked for years, can cannabis affect motivation? The truth is that's hard to measure. So what do? We look at what regulates motivation. Don't worry about the terminology as much as where it is, but what regulates motivation: the anterior cingulate cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Where's that in the brain? Right here. So when people say, can cannabis affect motivation? We certainly have reason to suspect there's that possibility. But all these other parts, we can do a much deeper dive into the actual impacts on the body and on the brain. When we look at what researchers consider the strong stuff, high potency cannabis, it's anything over 10% THC. I'll ask you to keep that number in mind. El Soli and colleagues in 2016 published this article that looked at 2 decades of potency in the United States. Every time there was a drug seizure by the DEA, a sample went to the University of Mississippi, and they were able to evaluate it for THC levels, CBD levels, the ratio of THC to CBD, and even adulterants. When packaged with Dr. Nora Volkov's 2014 article, we can estimate cannabis potency going back to the 1970s. When you hear people who are older today reflecting on their time in the 1970s, and they say that they, in quotes, smoked grass, it's because it was practically grass, 1.5% THC. In the 1980s, 2 to 3% THC. May all of your retirement portfolios grow like this. We saw 4% by 1995, 6% by 2001, 8% by 2006. We've been double digits since 2010. But then the chart runs out. At the end of 2021, these researchers updated it, and they showed that in the illicit market in the United States, we've seen on average what exceeds high potency cannabis since 2010. So researchers started saying, yeah, but what's been happening in states that have legalized for medical or non-medical purposes? Along with Colorado, my state legalized in 2012. Voters in Washington approved Initiative 502, November 6th, 2012. 1 month later, December 6th, 2012, legalization happened. The first stores didn't open until July 2014. Smart and colleagues said, let's look at the cannabis retail market in Washington state in the first 2+ years after it opened. Along the y-axis are the percent of total tax-inclusive sales. Along the x-axis, month and year. What's this little baby blue sliver? It's products with THC concentrations under 10%. That's been virtually eliminated from the retail market. Everything else is high potency cannabis. Brick red, 10 to 15, green, 15 to 20, purple is over 20%. Cash and colleagues said, well, let's look beyond just Washington. Let's look at states that have legalized for medical and non-medical purposes. You can see this title says recreational. We don't really talk about recreational cannabis in our state anymore. That was what the initiative referred to, but we don't talk about recreational alcohol use. And when we think of recreation, we think of hiking and fishing and biking and doing things outdoors. So Colorado, in their recreational or non-medical market, 95.91% of their market is high potency cannabis. In the state of California, it's only 0.01% off, 95.90. You can visibly see the big difference between Colorado and California is a larger portion of the California market is 10 to 15, but still nevertheless above 10% in high potency. In New England, you see a very consistent theme emerge since everything green and yellow is over 10% THC. In my state, 97% of the Washington retail market is high potency cannabis. When I look at the role parents, caregivers, and influential adults can play, one of those is just knowing these differences. I hear people say things like, well, I used when I was younger and I turned out fine. You used different stuff. I hear people say, it's just weed. It's natural. You saw from the data, it stopped being just weed years ago. In my state, smokable flower or bud, on average, 20 to 30% THC. Hash oils, concentrates, what people use for dabbing, 60 to 90% THC. Concentrations like that do not occur in nature. The concentrates have to be intentionally extracted and isolated. Smokable flower or bud that's 20 to 30%, that takes work. That takes intentional breeding of created high potency strains. So why does that matter? Well, DeForty and colleagues across 11 cities in Europe and Brazil showed that the frequency of using high potency cannabis, anything over 10%, mattered, especially when it comes to looking at the onset of psychotic disorder. People that used cannabis over 10% on a daily basis had a 4.8 to 5.8, rounding, 5 to 6 greater odds of developing psychotic disorder than people that didn't use at all. So when we look at mental health risks, potency matters. Hines and colleagues at the start of the pandemic in the United Kingdom looked at adolescents up to the age, going through young adults up to 24, and showed that using cannabis over 10% THC increased the risk of addiction, increased the risk of generalized anxiety disorder. Out of Canada, they looked at concentrates and extracts and said across the board, these are associated with more problematic cannabis use, more addiction, cannabis use disorder, and more mental health disorders. Finally, in my state, I'm a state employee. I work at the University of Washington. We're reminded every election season, you can't come out for or against a candidate or an initiative. That's a state ethics violation. So we tend to stay quiet and we speak when spoken to. Our state said something's changed in Washington, and we would like scientists to weigh in on high potency cannabis. What does the science really say? They said, we don't want one researcher doing that. It's too easy for that person to be accused of bias. We don't want one university doing that. Maybe it's a group of people that all play well together. They jokingly said, the University of Washington, Washington State University, you're big rivals. You don't agree on anything. What if we get researchers from both schools? And only if you can all agree on what the science says, will this ever see the light of day? As evidenced by this screenshot, We all agreed. You can go to this link and read the full 20-page report. If you're like, I don't have time to read 20 pages, there's a 2-page Cliff Notes version. Cliff was my favorite author when I was younger, so shout out to Cliff. There's even slides you can download. But what we concluded is that the high potency products are no joke for people, particularly under the age of 25. Young people are very vulnerable. And that's true with adolescents, with young adults. Not only the more potent a product is, but the more frequently people use it. Plus, the risk of developing addiction or cannabis use disorder goes up with the use of high potency products. This is very, very true for adolescents. We released this in 2020, but it didn't start getting attention of the public until this summer. The New York Times in June of 2022 wrote an article referencing this consensus statement. It was reprinted by our own Seattle Times. It was reprinted by lots of large newspapers. But the good news is we're getting the science out there. The not so good news is it's definitely taken some time. So when we look at what are clear guidelines we can speak to and what are some clear conclusions we can draw, one of them is the very clear impact on cognitive functioning and academic outcomes. The part of the brain that, among other things, affects attention, concentration, and memory is the hippocampus. Truly long story short, after cannabis use, the neurons in this part of the brain get suppressed. They fire, but they fire at a rate that's lower and slower than they could or should be firing. Harrison Pope is a Harvard scientist that said, I want to test this with college students. I don't want to get people super high and make them take a test. That doesn't feel very real world. I want to have people use cannabis. I want to test them a day later, 24 hours later. Dr. Pope found that a full 24 hours later, there were decreases in attention, concentration, and memory. And the more frequently people used, the more pronounced these decreases were. Scientists said, this is a game changer. No one's ever shown not only that day after effect, but the fact that there seemed to be an additive or cumulative impact. Critics said, is it that impressive? It's not causal. What if people who struggle with attention happen to prefer or like cannabis? So Dr. Pope said, that's fair, and we can test that. Ethically, we can't take people who don't use and make them start, because that's unethical. But what if we have people who are using every day and we have them quit and we follow them over time? If we follow them over time and their cognitive abilities stay the same, well, maybe they were there to start with. If we follow them over time and as they abstain, their cognitive abilities improve, that, my friends in California, that's causal. It takes 28 days, but 4 weeks after stopping daily cannabis use, there are no longer any measurable impacts on attention, concentration, and memory compared to a control group of people who've never used in their life. In your own state, down in San Diego, Susan Tapert was senior author on an article that said, forget daily use. What if we look at, on average, every other day? And what if we look at a sample of 15 to 19-year-olds who are stopping their use and we're following them over time? Verbal learning took 2 weeks of abstinence to match that of people who don't use. Verbal working memory takes 3 weeks of abstinence. Attention takes the full 4 weeks. If we're working with someone that says, I have ADHD, I've been diagnosed with that, I take something for it. We can also look them in the eye and say, cannabis is a horrible fit. We know of no substance more associated with causing attention decreases, let alone worsening existing ones. When people say, I wonder if I have an attention issue, can I get something prescribed and they're using cannabis? How can we pretend to diagnose if they do or don't have an attention issue if they're using a substance that causes attention decreases? So, we encourage, I work on a college campus, we encourage people to kind of keep their fingers on the pulse of how they're doing. And if they say, my memory, not great, I can't focus, I can't pay attention, and they're using cannabis, stopping their cannabis use will pay dividends on those cognitive abilities. The science shows it translates to student success. Look at the last 2.5 years. Certainly among the many narratives have been, especially that largely virtual year was really tough on students. And so we've heard people say, I want to be the biggest champion ever for student success, for student outcomes. I would say be a champion for the type of work the Parent Venture does. Be a champion for prevention, because what you do about substance use will pay dividends in the classroom. DuPont and colleagues released this foundational paper that said of all the problems that contribute to dropping out, substance use is one of the easiest to identify and one of the most easily stopped by interventions, including treatment. And when adolescents stop, they do better in school. Students who use substances are at increased risk for academic failure, including dropping out. And while both alcohol and cannabis matter, cannabis has a stronger negative relationship, meaning as cannabis use goes up, academic outcomes go down. Stronger negative relationship to grade point average and other outcomes, plus risk for dropout than alcohol does. The more severe the substance use, the more likely the impact on academic performance and risk for dropout. This doesn't go away once they get to college. The more frequently college students use cannabis, the lower their grade point average tends to be, the more classes they skip, the less likely they are to still be enrolled, and the less likely they are to graduate on time. When we ask college students, hey, what gets in the way of your academic success? They don't tend to say substance use. My friend and colleague Amelia Aria has said, if we did a better job of putting a spotlight on these associations, we might actually boost help seeking when students are struggling academically and using substances, because they may not be connecting the dots. These are data from the American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment. 41 schools, fall 2021, and 23,600 students. They asked students to identify if they didn't get a grade they were hoping for, did less well in a course than they anticipated, had to drop a course. What got in the way of their success? The top 5 of 51 factors students identified: procrastination, stress, anxiety, depression, and sleep difficulties. Alcohol use was in 34th place. Cannabis use was tied for 36th place with urinary tract infection and concussion and traumatic brain injury. Fortunately, we don't see rates of concussion and traumatic brain injury on college campuses like we see rates of cannabis use. But it's that potentially students aren't connecting the dots. We think there's a way to connect those dots and make that very clear. And this will be a chance. I want to show you the difference with alcohol and cannabis here. This article is fantastic. It summarizes everything we need to know about sleep and the impacts of alcohol use. Plus, if you look at the link, you'll see that this article is only 9 pages long, which is one of my criteria for a good article. I always hate when people send me articles that are like 50 pages long. And they're like, hey, Jason, you should read this. I'm like, you should read this. But Roars and Roth explain that if you want to have the perfect night's sleep, it should look like this. REM sleep is rapid eye movement sleep. It's where we do our dreaming. Non-REM are the other stages of sleep. Probably most well known is stage 4 or deep sleep. Sleep experts have made clear REM is overrated. It's not that more REM is better. What do you want? You want a pattern such that as the night progresses, your time in REM gets longer. Your time in deep gets less and less and less. If people go to bed after drinking, they'll say, I fall asleep faster. That makes sense. It depresses or slows down the central nervous system. But we can ask people, on nights where you've been drinking, what do you notice about your sleep? Tell me about your dreaming. People are like, whoa, how did you know? I don't dream at all. Or if I do dream, it's super vividly right before I wake up. Here's why. Go to bed with a positive blood alcohol level. Stay at a positive the whole night. The brain waves needed to kick into REM sleep don't happen. That will account for someone's subjective sense that they didn't dream. It's because they genuinely didn't enter REM sleep. If you have a positive BAC, positive, you hit a 0, you either wake up prematurely and often abruptly, or if you continue sleeping, go through an acute REM rebound. Too much time in REM, not enough time in the other stages of sleep, vivid, weird dreams. What's the impact of a night of REM-deprived sleep? Increases the next day in sleepiness, anxiety, irritability, and jumpiness. If people drink multiple nights in a row, these effects are additive or cumulative. If they take a night off, the body plays catch up. All of us have had the next night's sleep, whether you've ever touched a substance in your life or not. Why do I know that? because lots of things cause REM deprivation, including not sleeping, sleep deprivation. Think of the last time you were up all night, or you only got an hour or two of sleep. The next day, if you can pull it off, you sleep for 8, 9, 10 hours. How do you feel when you wake up? Tired, groggy. It's like, how do you feel tired? You got 10 hours of sleep, because quality of sleep different than quantity. I can't graphically show you insomnia any better than right there. A person will slam so fast into deep, immediately into REM, that rapid cycling leads to difficulty both falling and staying asleep. Once they get to sleep, too much time in REM, not enough time in the other stages of sleep, increase in fatigue the next day. What do college students say gets in the way of their academic success? Well, 3 of the top 5, stress, anxiety, and sleep problems. All 3 of those could be made worse by drinking at night. All 3 of those could be caused by drinking at night. This research was well established. In 2016, Angarita and colleagues showed what happened with cannabis. What we hear from students we work with is if they use weed at night, they say, I feel like I sleep hard. I sleep and I mean it. And I don't dream. Here's why. Much like with alcohol, onset of sleep will be faster. Cannabis is a sedative hypnotic. Sedative means sedating. Hypnotic means sleep inducing. But what they're calling sleeping hard is that stage 4 or deep sleep gets extended. Just like with alcohol, there's no REM, which is why people will say, I don't feel like I dream on those nights. Just like with alcohol, we see increases the next day in sleepiness, anxiety, irritability, and jumpiness. And just like with alcohol, these effects are additive or cumulative. Finally, if someone takes a night off, the next day you see REM rebound, which again can be associated with an increase in fatigue. So if someone says, I'm really struggling with anxiety, with being tired all the time, and they make the choice to avoid substance use, the science would back them up on that. If they say, I'm so anxious and I'm tired all the time, and they're using substances at night, calling time out on their substance use will completely result in improvements in sleep quality and improvement in all the symptoms you see on your screen. One of the hardest parts of working with people is when there's a loss of a student life. And when I think about the very heroes I have that do important work around suicide prevention, I'm so struck by just how noble and important that work is. And I will say, we've seen in the scientific literature, and we're seeing some emerging data about concerns about suicide risk for those with cannabis use disorder. In my eyes, planet Earth's single biggest expert on cannabis is Dr. Wayne Hall at the University of Queensland in Australia. His research talked about mental health early on, and his research showed that those that had used cannabis 10 or more times by the age of 18 were 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Dr. Hall said, these findings are so clear, we can make 13% of schizophrenia go away if cannabis use was prevented. After legalization, I reached out to Dr. Hall and I asked him to do a webinar for our college coalition that I had the honor of moderating. I asked him if we could do one thing in Washington after legalization, what would it be? And what he said was, I would screen for people being addicted to cannabis. I would screen for cannabis use disorder. When I asked him why, he said, we don't know what comes first and we don't know what drives what, but we see a scary 3-way interaction between depression, cannabis use disorder, and suicide that is so strong that if someone seeking help for depression also flags as being at risk for cannabis use disorder, that person poses a suicide threat that we do not understand, but that person becomes #1 priority for an assignment to provider. No one should be feeling like they need to be administering screening surveys to youth, but depending on your job, depending on in which capacity you're joining us tonight, I did want you to know the Washington Recovery Helpline has actually said, Dr. Hall said the best screening tool is the QDIT-R, the Cannabis Use Disorder Identification Test Revised. The state of Washington's Recovery Helpline said, let's get that out there. So it's a simple yes, no. Have you used any cannabis over the past 6 months? If no, you're done. If yes, there's 8 questions, and how to score it is at the bottom. This slide I had to make by hand because it didn't appear as a figure in the table, and I checked it multiple times to make sure there wasn't a mistake because it's just so striking. These are data from our own country's National Survey of Drug Use and Health. These are data from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they look at different endorsements of items related to suicide only as a function of, on the left, did the person meet criteria for past year cannabis use disorder, or was there no past year substance use disorder? You can see that serious thoughts of suicide, 6-fold increase in endorsing this among people with a past year cannabis use disorder. Making a suicide plan, 7 times increase. Attempting suicide, 7 times increase. My friend and colleague, Lori Davidson, in her work with the Suicide Prevention Resource Center, when all the data on alcohol and suicide came out, said, if you want to be a community that does good suicide prevention, do good alcohol prevention, because alcohol prevention is suicide prevention. As I look at data like this, I feel like we can make the same claim. Cannabis prevention is suicide prevention. And then more and more research continues to show the addiction potential. I am excited that I got to meet Dr. Gilman in December at a conference we're both going to. But Gilman and colleagues in March 2022 did a study in Massachusetts. Much like in my state, a person doesn't need a medical cannabis card to go get cannabis. If they're over 21, if they have a valid ID, they go into a retail store. But if they have a medical cannabis card, there are fees that they're exempt from, there are taxes that they're exempt from. Gilman and colleagues looked at people that were asking for a medical marijuana card. They either gave it to them immediately or they put them in a 12-week waitlist control group. As a successive randomization to condition, at baseline, both groups used cannabis at the same level of frequency. And probably not surprisingly, the group that got the medical marijuana card immediately increased their frequency of use compared to the group that was in the wait list. What surprised the researchers is that what also went up was endorsing symptoms associated with cannabis use disorder. They were seeing more addiction. Probably the most striking finding, and I'm quoting verbatim for fear of anyone thinking I'm putting words in the mouth of these scientists, there were no observed benefits of obtaining a medical marijuana card for pain, anxiety, or depressive symptoms. All of those stayed the same. What got worse? Cannabis use disorder symptoms. What got better? People's self-report of insomnia improving. We talked about that. Onset of sleep will be more rapid, but what happens to quality of sleep is that really gets affected. They said those dealing with anxiety or depression, affective disorders, have an almost 4 times higher odds of meeting criteria for cannabis use disorder. And they said that means a medical marijuana card may pose a high risk or even be contraindicated for people with affective disorders. Why is that so important to take note of? Depression is the 3rd most common reason people seek a medical marijuana card. So, especially for people working with students, if they're hearing, I'm really, really anxious, I'm really, really down, it's important to get students connected with services, with counseling, with support that has demonstrated effectiveness, with treatments that have effectiveness as we look at how we support them. And finally, a lot of the reasons young adults say they use could actually potentially be related to withdrawal. My friend and colleague, Dr. Christine Lee, asked incoming students, tell us why you use cannabis. And they said things like, I like getting high. It gives me something to do with my friends, helps me when I'm bored, makes things more fun, music sounds better, it's cool, it helps me celebrate. But they also said, helps me relax, helps me sleep, lets me cope when I'm depressed, relieves stress, helps when my appetite stinks, reduces anxiety, alleviates physical pain, helps when I have a headache. Is cannabis addictive? Yes, it is. There are clear criteria for cannabis use disorder, and there's even clear criteria for cannabis withdrawal. What are those criteria? Keeping this list in mind, it's the same list. Anxiety, sleep problems, appetite problems, depressed mood, and headaches. If someone says, I think that guy's wrong, I think it helps my anxiety, ask them, how do you know? If someone says, I use weed every day, and last week I ran out for 3 days, and it was brutal. My anxiety was terrible. I couldn't sleep. got my hands on weed again, all of that went away. That's not cannabis helping underlying anxiety or sleep. That's resuming substance use, making withdrawal symptoms stop. And that's an instance of managing potentially addiction more than those underlying issues. So I tried to pick, to leave time for questions, a handful of things that are opportunities and implications for prevention and the potential role of parents and caregivers. One of them is that parents, caregivers, and community members can play a part in what kids see and how they make sense of it. Helping kids, when you see a billboard, when you see an ad in a paper, when you potentially see public use, it's having the conversation about what that means. The article I've been an author on that I'm arguably most proud of is this one. I think it's been read by 3 people. And why I'm so proud of it is one of my co-authors was my younger brother, who's a professor at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. We worked with my colleague, Paul Grossberg, at the University of Wisconsin. And as we looked at the role of media on adolescent substance use, we looked at the alcohol field, and we saw that in the alcohol field, the more that adolescents, teens, youth are exposed to drinking in television, advertisements, and movies, the more likely they are to use themselves. In a review of 13 studies, 12 of the 13 showed that the more media exposure there were, the more that drinking was initiated among people that weren't drinking, and those already drinking increased their consumption. Research needs to be done to look at the impact of statements that we see and in media we see related to cannabis. In my state, if you land at SeaTac Airport, hang a left out of the airport and head north to the city of Seattle, this is the first billboard that greets you to my state. We can chill with the subliminal weed, cannabis chill, it's legal. I mean, it doesn't make clear that's for people over 21. And that sets a tone, right? That sets a tone about permissiveness. So there's a chance to kind of discuss what that means with kids. This is not a cannabis retail store. This is a dog grooming store about 1.5 miles from where I live, now selling CBD for you and your pet. We don't have a lot of good research on what CBD does with people, let alone with animals. This is from our sports page. Don't know what to get your loved one Valentine's Day? Cannabis. I grew up with a family of 5 and 3 brothers. There's 3 of us. I have 2 little brothers. We always wanted to get the sports page and the comics. This was a half-page ad in the sports page. So again, it's what does that do to perceived norms? What do kids make of that? If you landed at SeaTac Airport, when University Place was hosting the US Open, there was a guide to the 18 holes. This was the 19th hole, was a cannabis ad. If you stay at any hotel in Washington State, the magazine that are in hotel rooms, you go through and work your way to the centerfold by seeing ads like this. The centerfold is a map of cannabis retail stores. I don't begrudge, and I hope no one's mishearing me. Certainly places have the right to advertise, but it's making sense of what this means for kids becomes important too. My local paper, I live in Olympia, Washington. The Olympian had a 420 edition on April 20th of the Olympian with an insert that included things that seemed to be fairly appealing to kids. And that was something that we were told wasn't going to happen. There was a fairly simple word find. There was a coloring contest to win Mariners tickets. There was a maze. And right above the infused guacamole ad was a spot the difference game. If your sense is, I feel like that would appeal to kids, it'll probably appeal to kids. So it's having those conversations. This, from summer of 2014, when cannabis retail stores opened, people often say, you know, what was that from? Is that from just a local bookstore? This was from our university bookstore. I will quickly point out this was taken down as soon as some noise started being made, including by this fellow right here. But incoming first-year students, most of whom are under 21, what are we communicating if this is the first table they see when they walk in? I'll give a shout out to students at Western Washington University who, when they saw the legislation that said ads are not allowed to appeal to kids, they called out this ad. You can go to this website, and it's an article written by a Western Washington University student that said, there's zero world in which this billboard doesn't appeal to kids. we're gonna encourage that this to be taken down. And it was their initiative that led to that being taken down. I do think you can consider event-specific prevention and or enforcement, particularly if it's an event where there will be driving. The authors of Initiative 502 set driving under the influence at 5 nanograms of THC per milliliter of blood for those over 21 and any positive amount for those under 21. Why'd they pick 5? It's not the same as being drunk, but it's the similarities in impairment in reaction time and ability to shift focus when there are multiple competing stimuli that we see at 0.08 for alcohol. How long does it take to drop below 5 nanograms? The best science we have says waiting at least 6 to 8 hours after inhaling, 8 to 12 hours if it's orally ingested. Retail stores opened in 2014. Within 1 year, we saw that THC present in fatalities almost doubled. By 2017, we became a state where drugged driving deaths outnumbered drunk driving deaths. And finally, if a picture's worth 1,000 words, this picture speaks volumes. This is not police activity. This is not DUIs. This is not a new way of testing. This is drivers in my state involved in fatal crashes who were THC positive. Stable, 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 stable. Black line is legalization. Up, up, up. I think people get don't drink and drive. I think we have more work to do on cannabis and driving. And why that's so noteworthy is that April 20th is a high-risk event. Bravo and colleagues showed that on 420, more people report use, there's more unique sessions of use, and a larger amount used. Staples and Redelmeyer, using 25 years of data in the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's fatality analysis reporting system, showed that the risk of a fatal crash does go up on 420 compared to control dates of 413 and 427. That can be devastating for a community. But what's the good news? We know when that is. Like, heads up, we got 5.5 months to plan for 420, 2023. I think you can correct misperceived norms. Most people aren't using. Most people are not driving under the influence. The more people use, the more they think others are using. So there's opportunities in personalized normative feedback, personalized feedback interventions, social norms campaigns, positive community norms. Do consider what you're offering for those 21 and older. I'm lead author on an article we just got published this spring using data from our young adult health survey. We asked almost 13,000 18 to 25-year-olds in Washington from right before when retail stores opened and then 5 time points afterwards. We controlled for everything we could to be as conservative as possible. Sex assigned at birth, race, ethnicity, where they were in Washington, age, 4-year college status or not, full-time employment status, and further weighted the data with census data to be as conservative as we could. And what we found is in this age group of 18 to 25-year-olds, after implementation of legalization, any past year use, there's a significant increase over time. Any past month, at least monthly, significant increase over time. At least weekly use, significant increase over time. At least daily use. When we do a deeper dive for some of those categories, it's those over 21 gaining access to the legal market who are driving those increases. That was the case with any past year use. That was the case with at least monthly. But when people say, what does that mean though? Are just more people trying it? What we also saw a significant increase in is people endorsing symptoms associated with cannabis use disorder. So we are seeing more people using frequently, and even using with past year cannabis use disorder symptoms. I would say be aware, even for adults, of what's being recommended for lower risk use. This article, I mean, if someone said you could read, I actually had to do this. I spoke in a class today. The professor said, you can assign 1 reading. What are you going to assign? I assigned this. This is our planet's who's who of cannabis experts. There's Dr. Hall from Australia. Here's the Netherlands, single biggest name. Researchers from Mexico, from Canada, from the US, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, Canada, Brazil. This is it. Look at the title. It's not low risk guidelines, it's lower risk. They said, if you look at the science at this moment, there is no safe level of cannabis use. If you want to avoid Risk of harm, abstinence is the only way to do that. They said if people insist on using or make the choice to use low potency where possible. Realize that there's no one safe route of use. All the different routes incur risks, but smoking is particularly risky. Keep use occasional. They define that as a day or two a week, weekend only. If you notice the cognitive stuff I mentioned earlier, stop. If stopping is not realistic, substantially reduce frequency and potency. And there's the warning about driving. They said if people intend to procreate or are pregnant or breastfeeding, to abstain from cannabis use toward reducing a number of issues, including possible risks for reproduction and of health harm to offspring. They also said if you have a first-degree family history of or actively dealing with a psychotic disorder, mood disorder, or substance use disorder, consider abstaining or at least adjusting your use. I think the risks are out there. Do things like you're doing tonight. I think the more we can get the science in people's hands, the better. And finally, I'll end by saying, realize the amazing influence parents, caregivers, and community members have. These are data from sophomores in high school, 10th graders in my state, the state's Healthy Youth Survey. Hey kids, do you think your parents think it's wrong for you to use marijuana or not wrong? When kids said, my parents think it's wrong, 13% nevertheless reported using in the past 30 days. When kids said, my parents wouldn't care, 59% used in the past month. Look at this turnout tonight. Communities care. When kids say, do you think the community norm is that it's wrong for you to use or not wrong? When kids said, I think that the community would think it's wrong if we use, 16% used in the past month. When kids said, our community wouldn't care, that prevalence more than doubled. Obviously, you have your own local resources. If it's helpful to check out, starttalkingnow.org in Washington, available in 37 languages. Learn about cannabiswa.org has a parent guide to preventing underage marijuana use. collegeparentsmatter.org. You don't even have to be a parent of a college student to check this out, but I love the way they make it a choose your own adventure book. You go to topics, you click on topics, and then it says cannabis. Click on cannabis, and it says, what do I do if I'm not sure if my child's using? I know they're using, but I don't know how much, or I know they use regularly. They said, don't be afraid to have this conversation. You're allowed to disapprove of substance use. Give yourself permission to disapprove. Look at all the science we just reviewed. I think it's worth disapproving. So banish any fear that your disapproval is naive. Focus on one message during the conversation. Reject the myth that discouraging substance use is useless because, quote, everyone is doing it. Everyone is not doing it. These are data. You obviously have your own local data, but nationwide data, the overwhelming majority of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders do not use. If a student pushes back and says, but everyone uses, that's not true. I work with the age group that uses the most, and most college students do not use. Most young adults do not use. When we look at current use, we look at past month. 1 in 4 college students use cannabis in the past month. What does that mean? 3 out of 4 don't. Make communication a regular activity and recognize the power of your influence. I'll end by saying this. I'm married to a 6th grade teacher. I could not do what she does. And this is either the most influentially awesome parents in the world with a great sense of humor, or there's a slight chance we do need to course correct a little bit here. I was in high school from 1983 to 1987, so clearly I have good taste in music. And this really spoke to me. I begged her for permission to show this, and she said, as long as you don't have the kid's name. What was the assignment? Here's a blank map of the world. Label every continent and every ocean. One of the kids in her class labeled Africa as Africa by Toto, who of course sing about blessing the rains down in Africa. And I think that kid is either hilarious or they might accidentally think that's actually the name of that continent. I'll end by saying, keep doing what you're doing. Keep collaborating. Communities that do like what you're doing tonight are the ones I've seen have success. The goal is to leave at least 10 minutes for questions. We're leaving 11. That was a lot. I'm so sorry for the glitch at the very, very beginning. I don't know if that was bandwidth in our community or me just sharing my screen. But Charlene, again, you're so fantastic. My email address is there, jkilmer@uw.edu. If there are articles people wanted more information about, I've sent the PDF of these handouts to Charlene and her team. With that, I'm going to stop talking and try and answer as many questions as we can in the 10 minutes we have. Charlene, I'll tag over to you.
All right. Wow. Thank you, Jason. That was a lot. That was a lot. And I want to thank everybody who's been on with us this whole time for all your amazing questions. Very honest, very vulnerable. Let's get at it, Jason, and see as many as we can get to, okay?
Sure.
Here's a really good one. Thank you, the dad who wrote it. Says, my child's already using and most of her friends are. I've decided to take a harm reduction approach. I'm pretty sure she's going to keep using. My rule is always get it from a store, open communication with me about usage, and reduce usage when alone. Is this still dangerous?
I mean, you saw the science from Fisher and colleagues. What they say is there's no amount of use that's safe. I mean, from a harm reduction perspective, we've always acknowledged that any steps towards reduced risk are steps in the right direction. That said, even with reduced use, especially before the age of 25, there are a lot of harms and a lot of risks. Do with all of that as you wish, but that's the best researchers we have on the globe say that while we can make guidelines for lower risk use, any use is going to incur risks and harms.
Okay. So Jason, what parents always hear from their kids and they, do their research is it's natural, it's not addictive. What do you say to that?
I mean, we hear that, and that's not unique to kids in California. We hear the same thing up here. It's natural, it's safer than alcohol, it's just weed, it's not addictive. The science tells a very different story. It's not even new that there are diagnostic criteria for being addicted. It's just the terminology's changed. 10 years ago, we talked about cannabis dependence separate from cannabis abuse. Now we talk about cannabis use disorder. It is addictive. When people say it's natural, I will say again, sadly, the dabs, the concentrates, these do not occur in nature. These are isolated and extracted cannabinoids, and the potency we're seeing of smokable flower or bud, that doesn't occur in nature either. That takes breeding of created high potency strains.
Yeah, I hate to say it, but here we are in Menlo Park in the Bay Area, and we have one of the biggest Al-Anon groups meetings in California. And those meetings are not just full of kids who have opioid addiction problems. There's also plenty of kids in there that have cannabis addiction problems. And I just don't think people believe it.
No. Yeah, it doesn't do a service to anybody when they hear it's not addictive. It is. And there are clear withdrawal symptoms associated with it. And there are clear counseling support, relapse prevention, recovery support available for people who are struggling.
All right. So here's the question then, Jason, if you would. Parent asks, how is it addictive physiologically?
Well, from a physiological standpoint, what we do see is it does seem to be dose dependent, but also potency dependent. As potency goes up, addiction potential physiologically goes up. As frequency of use goes up, addiction potential goes up too. So, really, really potent stuff that's used a little less frequency can be addictive just as less potent stuff used more frequently. So there's an interaction between what people are using and how often they're using it.
Okay. Parent asks, is there any reliable research on CBD, not THC, for treating adolescents or young adults with depression and or anxiety in lieu of other antidepressant treatment?
So I'm going to pull up a slide from a talk that I did in a class today, where the key to understanding the role of something like CBD is also understanding that when people are told, oh, you have anxiety, here, use this, it will help. You've planted an expectancy potential. You've planted a potential placebo effect. So let me grab the slide and I will show you right now. Here we go. If I freeze again when I share my screen, I apologize. This article by Arndt and DeWitt is brilliant. They recruited people who all signed consent forms and said, I agree to take something that could include CBD, but it was a double-blind experiment. What does that mean? You eliminate expectancies. The person taking it didn't know what condition they were in. The person bringing it to them did not know what the condition they were in. There were 4 conditions, and on 4 separate occasions, they would take something and then go through tasks that got them upset, got them down, got them anxious. It induced unwanted mood or affect. What were the 4 conditions? A placebo, sugar, 300, 600, or a stunning 900 milligrams of CBD. When you eliminated expectancies, what did CBD do? Nothing. Quoting verbatim, oral CBD does not alter responses to emotional stimuli or produce anxiolytic. What does that mean? Anxiety reducing like effects in healthy human subjects. We have counseling that works. We have therapy that works. We have treatments that work. So the science that's out there does not tell the story I think a lot of people would hope it would. And if someone says, I'm having a tough time with anxiety or depression, it's getting them connected with services or support that has more effectiveness behind it.
All right. Jason, again, Dad asks, if your child's already using, what kind of harm reduction strategies would you suggest?
I mean, you saw the guidelines from Fisher and colleagues. Obviously, I don't know the age that we're talking here, and we probably don't need to know those details other than to say any steps towards reduced risk, less frequent use, less potent use, certainly not driving. You know, we hear too many people say, well, I drive better when I'm high. None of that's true. And the data tell a very, very different story. We always want to make sure there's not a mixed message. I mean, it's illegal for people under 21 in both of our states, making sure that they understand that independent. And so especially if they're involved in sports, if there's testing, either at the high school level, if they go on to college at the college level, it's being aware of things like that. If their main hope is, I want to go to college one day, I want to do whatever, it's making sure they're aware of those academic impacts. Because honestly, any amount of use does affect attention, concentration, memory, and academic outcomes. So, you know, for any one person, what strategy works best for them is going to vary. But we do continue to say any steps towards less frequent use, less potent use, not driving, certainly can be steps in the right direction.
And share some of those resources that you shared with your
That's
kids, right, Jason?
Yeah, absolutely.
So we've got a few questions that are related to advice that kids are getting from therapists. This is confusing for people. Parent says, when our child talked to their therapist about their fears for a friend who's about to use, therapist said, it's a matter of when, not if you yourself will use weed someday. What's a parent in a non-substance using house to do to combat that view?
I mean, I would never, I feel like I shouldn't comment on what another healthcare provider says, but you saw the data, you saw the norms. It's not true that everyone's going to use. The most significant misperceptions of the prevalence of cannabis use come from people that use themselves. And the more frequently people use, the more convinced they are that all of your data are wrong and that everyone uses. Yet, study after study after study after study shows that most people don't use. And so, I mean, you saw in my state, the data from our published study. On the one hand, use is going up and most people aren't using. And that's after 8 years of implementation, that's after 10 years of legalization. So I think having your own local data, which I see Bev just put in the chat, becomes important. If someone says, I don't want to start using, you've made the choice that most kids have made.
And for those of you who may be new to it, that is social norms research. Look it up. Jason also works with folks at the Montana Institute. They do great work around this topic. Check it out. Jason, parent asks, are there any benefits to using cannabis?
We always ask people, what are the good things about cannabis for you? What are the not so good things? And there's no like vitamin C, like antioxidant properties of prospective use having something in this way. But, you know, as someone that works with human beings for a living, we always want to get a sense of if someone's using something, what is it that they like about it? And so I think that that answer varies. You saw in Dr. Lee's research that I shared, people said all these different things, like it gives me something to do when I'm bored. I like how it makes me feel. The thing we try and look at is, so if you're bored, are there things you could do that won't have those strings attached of affecting cognitive abilities, impairing sleep, and so on? If those not so good things start to outnumber the good things, that's where it can become problematic for people. And so we ask any one person we work with, what are the good things about use for you? Then we ask them, what are the not so good things? I've never worked with someone that said, well, there are none. They identify things they don't like so much.
All right, well, we still have questions that we could stay and answer, but we are going to provide people with the video of this event and Jason's slides. Jason, in the minute that we've got together, what kind of final words do you want to leave our parents and caregivers with?
I just thank you for taking the time to be a part of this tonight. Obviously, the Parent Venture is a group that cares a lot about kids in your community and supporting parents in what they do. That's amazing. Charlene, you've been nothing but a gem and a joy of a human being to work with. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart for what you do. Never question for a second the value of the work that you do. And never question as a second as parents, guardians, caregivers, the unbelievable influence you have. Taking the time to learn about stuff like this, so important. So thank you. For those that were providing translation tonight, thank you. I hope I didn't talk as fast as I fear I might have, and I appreciate your role in tonight as well.
Dr. Jason Kilmer, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for all the information. Thank you for everybody who's been with us tonight. Look at all those floating emojis. We love that.
I love the floating emojis.
I love them so much. Take care, everybody. Stay well, and we hope. Look at that. They're just taking off, Jason. Thank you, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Good night.